Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 deals with perception. What you see is what you get. This is an important chapter with regards to interpersonal communication because it allows us to better understand the reasons that we view situations, people, and experiences that we have in the way that we do. So this chapter will allow us to understand more thoroughly the different perceptual influences that shape how we view others and their behavior, and also the ways in which other people may view us and our behavior, so that we can get a better sense of the ideas behind perception and how perception is a filter for us in terms of our communication. When we acknowledge that perception is a filter, it allows us to potentially make modifications if we see situations where maybe we are seeing things with a certain type of a slant because of perceptual influences. So this chapter allows us to dissect some of these issues a little more closely, and hopefully it will be useful for you folks in terms of your relational communication. Let's get started. The perception process involves 4 stages. The first of these is selection. The second is organization. The third is interpretation. And the fourth is negotiation. So through these 4 stages, we make sense of the various interactions that we have in our daily lives, and we ultimately are able to create shared meaning with other people through these communication processes, which involve the sharing of our own perceptions with other people and vice versa. So each of these stages will be explored one by one in the following slides. Selection. In terms of selection, or in terms of selecting what information to attend to in our communication interactions with other people, we tend to notice things or select things to notice that tend to have higher intensity. This relates to things like noise or volume. Of course, related to volume are things like how loud are people talking, how loud is one person talking in regards to a group of other people talking amongst a crowd, right? We also might notice things that are brighter in terms of color or lights, right? We would notice bright colors more than colors that are more neutral or muted. So if we were in a crowd of people, we would probably notice people in the crowd that were wearing reds or bright yellows more readily than people who were wearing white, perhaps, okay? Or maybe gray or other neutral tones. And we tend to generally notice things that are more extreme. So intensity is one factor that plays into the selection process in terms of perception. Repetition is another aspect of selection that tends to shape perception. So for example, when we hear advertisements on the radio, or when we hear advertisements on television, or nowadays on the web, or on YouTube, or Pandora, or any of those types of online media forums that we might subscribe to, one of the things that these advertising companies are banking on is repetition. So the idea behind repetition is that people will remember or select to remember certain ideas that tend to be more repetitive than others, okay? So this can include obviously an advertisement or a message, but it can also include interactions with certain people, right? We might tend to pay attention more to the things that people say when we have more interactions with them on a daily basis. So repetition is definitely one aspect that shapes the kind of information that we select. In addition, issues of contrast and change also tend to shape the selection process. So for example, if you tend to have a group of people who are wearing sports gear, and you're in let's say a university function, and it's a sports game, right? And everyone's wearing sports gear, they're showing their team pride, with the sports gear and the specific gear that should be the team that you're supporting, right? So let's say you have a bunch of people who are wearing all of the gear for the team that you want to support, and you're all sitting in a certain section at the sporting event, and everyone's cheering for their team, right? Well, I'm sure that if you saw somebody wearing the clothing supporting the opposite team that you did not want to win, that type of contrast or change would be much more noticeable. In addition, if you have ongoing interactions with other people and suddenly one day their communication style or the topics they choose to talk about or the way in which they communicate is very different, you would probably notice that contrast more than if there was a slight or subtle difference. In addition, we tend to be motivated, or we tend to select things to attend to based on our motivation. So what are the motivations that we have in a certain interaction, and how do those motivations shape the various ideas or concepts or things that we attend to or notice that people talk about? So for example, if you have a friend in a class that you're taking at the university and you are interested in this person romantically, you might tend to select to attend or notice information that deals with whether they are involved in a romantic relationship or not. You might perk up and listen especially carefully if they talk about the kind of person that they would like to date, or somebody that maybe they appreciate or like themselves. So our motives definitely shape the information we select to attend to. We can think about motives also in terms of the environment that we're living in. So for example, some people who are very time-oriented would probably have clocks and watches and things that are reminding them about what time it is, or calendars, right? Things like that. They would probably have those kinds of decor or instruments in their home because time is something that they tend to focus on, right? So motives are things that definitely influence how we select information. But you could also think about something like, in terms of motives, if you were in the market for a car, and let's say you had decided that you were going to buy a certain type of a car. Let's say hypothetically you decided you wanted to buy a SUV, like a small SUV, because winter's coming and you want to have something that's going to handle the roads when they're wet. Then you might start to notice every single SUV that you see driving around on the street, trying to think about, well, I wonder if that would be a good one to look at, or I wonder if that would be a good one. So the motives that we have shape the information that we select to pay attention to. I also gave this example a few minutes ago, and I'll mention it again, but if we were interested in someone in terms of a romantic relationship, we would probably select certain types of information to pay more attention to than others, right? Especially information that had something to do with whether they were single, whether they wanted to be in a relationship, what kind of people they might want to date. Okay, so these are all things that can shape the information that we select to pay attention to when we interact with other people. Organization. Organization is a very important part of the perception process. We can think of organization in terms of a figure ground principle. And in your textbook, there's a visual image that you can look at in Chapter 3 that allows you to play around with this idea of figure ground. There is a picture of a vase, and if you look at it with your eyes, emphasizing a certain part of the photo, you'll see a vase, right? However, if you allow your eyes to adapt a little bit to the other side of the vase, which is the right and the left side of the vase, you might actually see two faces staring at each other, communicating, right? So figure ground is one aspect that includes organization. And you can also think of figure ground in terms of conversations that you might be having. Let's take the example, for instance, of being in a room full of people where there's a party happening, let's say, a social gathering. And you might be in a group conversing with 3 or 4 people, and there might be some other groups near you conversing in circles. And all of a sudden, you hear your name being mentioned in one of the other circles. Now, I don't know about you, but if I am at a social gathering and somebody says my name from across the room in their conversation, my ears immediately perk up and I start to try to listen to what those people or that person is saying about me. So that's another way to think about figure ground in more of an auditory way, which of course deals with communication, because communication is most of the time auditory. However, we have lots of other ways to communicate. There's visual communication, right? There's nonverbal cues. There are some people that do not use audio communication at all. So we can think of folks who are deaf, for example, right? Many people who are deaf might use American Sign Language completely to communicate, even if they have an opportunity to get an implant and ear implant and try to talk. They might choose to just communicate through American Sign Language. So we can think about figure ground in terms of how we organize or make sense of information, and it's definitely an important part of the organization process. We've talked through the figure foreground and the ground background of one voice versus many voices. So next time you're at a social gathering, start to notice what types of voices or conversations you tend to organize or make sense of, and how your motives may play into that. Another aspect of organization is perceptual schema. Perceptual schema deals with the ways that we organize information about people, and this might include the ideas that we have about what people look like, so appearance-based assumptions. So you might see a person walking down the street, and based on the race that they are, and the age that they are, and the sex that they are, and the way that they dress, you may conclude a whole host of assumptions about that person without any actual conversations or interactions with the person, right? So you can think about how appearance might shape the way that we view other people and communicate with them, and how that can shape impressions that we develop or assumptions that we have about people, which, as we know, the ideas we carry around in our head about other people definitely can shape the way that we relate to them. So it's important to be aware of that. But we can also think about organization in terms of people's social roles. So one thing we know is that there are certain social expectations for a lot of people in society. So you might have certain expectations that are given to you from your family or your parents. You may have expectations that you have placed on you from society or the media. You may have expectations that your romantic partner or spouse places on you, right? Or you may even have social role expectations that you place on yourself. And so the way that we make sense of the interactions we have and the impressions we develop can be based on appearance and social roles, which include this idea of perceptual schema. We might also organize information based on interaction or psychological style. So, for example, you may have a certain type of interactional style that is unique to you. You may come into communication with others on a day-to-day basis that are not in the same camp as you. So, for example, some people tend to be very extroverted in their interactional style, whereas other people tend to be more introverted. So you can think about how the perceptions that you develop about another person are often filtered through the schema about what preferred style of interaction we have, or the way that things should be going, or how people should be behaving or communicating. You might even place these expectations on yourself. And in addition, psychological style can also shape the way that we organize information. So for example, people that tend to be more type A personality tend to make sense of the world in a different way than people who are a type B personality or more laid back. Type A personalities tend to be much more organized. They're highly motivated. They like to do things like write lists and cross things off their lists and get things done, right? A lot of times type A personalities tend to like things to be a certain way. And so that is a certain type of a psychological style that can interact in different ways with people who might have the same psychological style or a different style, right? So we can think about the ways in which organizational issues shape the perceptual process. In addition, group membership can also shape the way that we view situations. So, which types of groups do we belong to? What are the values associated with those group memberships? And how do those values shape the way that we view other people? People who behave in the same way as us, people who behave in different ways than us. All of these things are very relevant factors in the organization process. Another aspect of organization deals with stereotypes. Stereotypes are exaggerated assumptions or generalizations that we might carry around about certain people or certain groups of people in terms of what they are like. Now, some of the challenges associated with stereotypes are that they tend to not be accurate for most people that belong to that group. There may be a certain grain of truth to certain stereotypes. However, oftentimes assuming things about people just based on group membership is actually a hindrance or a challenge to effective interpersonal communication. However, the process of stereotyping is actually a very heuristic human shortcut. And the reason why we tend to do this is because it is simply impossible for us to completely evaluate every single new situation or new person or new scenario that we come into contact with on a day-to-day basis. So in order to prevent information overload, people develop heuristic shortcuts, which are assumptions about what we should think about situations or people based on these sort of very limited aspects of group identity. So what people look like, or what religion they belong to, or what race they are, or perhaps what age they are, whether they're young or elderly, or perhaps whether they are a man or a woman, okay? So we want to be careful about stereotyping because a lot of times stereotypes are not accurate. We can oftentimes place people into boxes when we communicate, and oftentimes stereotypes can impede or challenge effective communication because we might go into a communication interaction with somebody having expectations about them that are false. And of course, any kind of expectations or assumptions that we have can sometimes lead us to make decisions when we interact with people that can lead to very awkward situations, or maybe hurt people's feelings, or maybe make them uncomfortable or make ourselves uncomfortable. So generally speaking, it's always good to just talk with people and ask them the kinds of questions that you would want other people to ask you when you're getting to know them, and to ask more open-ended questions about what people like or don't like, or things that they do or don't do, rather than assuming that you already know about them and trying to steer a conversation based on those things. Now, there are some things, obviously, where, if you know, for example, that you both like the same sports team, you can definitely use that as some information to guide conversations. But what we really want to be careful of is not assuming things about anyone until we actually have heard that truth from the person themselves, okay? So think about the different assumptions or expectations that you have about people based on gender, race, age, religion, or any other types of assumptions or stereotypes you might have. And then I would encourage you to also think about where you acquired those stereotypes. So for most of us, we tend to acquire stereotypes in our family systems through listening to conversations with parents or other family members. We might also develop stereotypes from our social interactions. And still yet, we tend to also develop ideas from the media and from the kinds of portrayals that we see in television shows, in films, and cartoons, and things like that. Okay? So we definitely want to be conscious of stereotypes. And if you notice stereotypes shaping your perception, it's good to become aware of them. I definitely do not encourage making yourself feel bad about a stereotype. That's not my intention in talking about this. And in fact, it's good to acknowledge that everybody does have stereotypes. However, it is a very human process, and at the same time, it tends to limit or challenge communication. So we want to be conscious of that so that we can have the most effective interactions with people whenever possible. Now, one of the reasons why stereotypes tend to remain relatively fixed over time, which means that it's difficult to change the stereotypes that we already have right now, is because human beings have a need for cognitive consistency. Cognitive consistency is basically the idea that we want to continue to see the world in the way that we have seen the world until today, or we want to continue to have the same ideas about people or situations or issues in the same way that we did before. And because of this, the ideas we carry around about other people or groups of people can be very resistant to change, even when we have information or interactions that tend to challenge those assumptions, right? So we want to be careful not to latch on to stereotypes and allow them to color our communication with people. And it's always good to go into interactions with an open mind. And I always like to suggest that it's always good to approach communication with other people with the golden rule, which is treat other people as you yourself would want to be treated, right? So I think that if we try that empathy perspective, it definitely is a very positive way to go about approaching interactions with people who we know well or people who we don't know well. Punctuation is another component of the organization process, and punctuation deals with where in time or when in time or what issues contributed to the relationship status that currently exists. So for example, you may have a couple, a romantic couple, and perhaps one person in the relationship has been withdrawing lately because they feel like their partner is always nagging them at home to do things around the house, and so they may be staying late at work and going out with their friends more, things like that. And so in their mind, the relationship started to have problems when their partner began to nag them. However, from the other partner's perspective, they might be nagging the partner that is staying late at work and going out with their friends because they just want more attention and they just want more time together. And, staying in sort of a nagging perspective, or kind of trying to get the person to hang out at home and do stuff with them, is their way of attempting to get close, right? So if you ask both of those people, when did the problem or when did the relationship start having issues, the person who's sort of withdrawing might say, well, the relationship had problems when my partner started nagging me to do stuff all the time. And from the other person's perspective, they might say, well, the relationship started having issues when my partner started withdrawing all the time, right? So this is one of the reasons why it's so important to learn how to share our perceptions with our romantic partners or our family members or friends in a way that is non-threatening and non-accusatory, and in ways that do not make people defensive, so that we can actually reach a shared understanding about the way that we perceive issues. So punctuation is a very important part of the organization process, and I'm sure you can probably think of examples in your own life where these various aspects of organization have shaped the way that you view certain issues, and in many cases, the way that we approach communicating about these issues. So organization is definitely something to be aware of. Interpretation. Interpretation is another important aspect of the perception process. What's interesting about interpretation is that the more involved we are with certain people or groups of people, the more positive or more favorable our evaluations tend to be about those groups of people. In addition, interpretation contributes to the likelihood that our experience in the past, or the types of interactions we've had with people in our past, will shape the way that we make sense of interactions in the present. So for example, people that have had very positive romantic interactions in the past will probably go into future romantic interactions with an expectation for a positive relationship or a positive outcome. On the other hand, if you know someone who has had very challenging relational past experiences, they might go into a current relationship with less positive expectations, which of course can shape how they interpret the information that they take in or the communication that they have with people today. So one thing that I encourage students to do is to think about the past experiences you've had in your family systems, your family communication interactions, in your friendship communication interactions, certainly in your romantic past interactions, and ask yourself, how do you think those past interactions shape the way that you view the world, the way that you view yourself, the way that you view other people more generally, and the expectations that you have for current interactions. It's good to be aware of these things, and certainly achieving a knowledge about these things requires a certain level of introspective contemplation. But I guarantee you that if you do think about some of these things, it will provide you with more information to better understand why it is that you view the world in the way you do, and why it is that you interpret things in the way that you do. And if, in some cases, people discover that some of their negative interactions in the past tend to shape the way that they interpret current day interactions in a less favorable way, then you can use that knowledge to temper the ways that you perceive things by reminding yourself that this is a different relationship, this person is not the same person as another person, and things like that. Another thing that's related to experience, past experience, and levels of involvement is the assumptions that we have about people. And I talked about this in number 2 here, but I'm just going to touch on it again, that the assumptions that we carry around about the world, about people generally, about ourselves, and about the way that relationships should be definitely shape our interpretation of our communication interactions with people. So, for example, if we grew up in a household where our parents had very fixed gendered roles in terms of how the family and the household was managed, so let's say it was a very traditional household, let's say that the gendered roles, social roles were fixed, so perhaps the father was the breadwinner and the mother was the nurturer who stayed home with the children, okay? And even the types of chores and household duties that they would achieve were very gendered, so typical, stereotypical things like men doing the snow shoveling or taking care of the cars and women doing more of the house care, things like that. If you grew up in a household where that was the norm, then it is very likely that the expectations that you have about the way relationships should be will be shaped by those past experiences. So think about the assumptions you have and consider the ways in which your past experiences have shaped the assumptions you have today, and how those assumptions shape the way that you make sense of your communication interactions with other people. So, what are the assumptions that we hold about relationships and social interactions? Sometimes we don't even realize what our assumptions are until we meet other people who have different assumptions than us. And you might figure this out by having conversations with friends or conversations with a romantic interest. And it's certainly worth discussing these issues, especially if you're considering going into a long-term romantic relationship with someone. It's definitely worth considering your own assumptions about romantic roles and relationships and what people bring into those relationships and behaviors in the relationship and things like that, so that you can talk about those things, so that you can make sure that you are with someone who shares enough similarity in the assumptions that you have so that the relationship is satisfying. I definitely encourage students in all of my classes to consider these issues, and it is worthwhile to pay attention to these things, especially early on in the relationship. Even when things are really exciting and romantic, definitely it's great to talk about these things to see how workable a long-term partnership is with regards to your backgrounds and your assumptions and your values. In addition, the attitudes that we carry tend to shape sense-making of various interactions we might have. So you may have certain attitudes about the way that people should live their lives. And so if you were to come into communication or conversations with people who live their life in a very drastically different way than you, it's very likely that those attitudes would shape how you interpret the person and their communication and their behaviors and things like that. So what are the attitudes that we have about ourselves or other people? How do those attitudes shape the way that we approach communication? In what situations do our attitudes sometimes hold us back in terms of really engaging in communication that is truly open and seeks to understand. Definitely worth considering. Interpretation also includes expectations. Expectations involve the cognitive or emotional ideas that we carry about future events and what we expect will happen. Now, we've talked about several things that can shape the expectations we have, so I'm not going to go into that too much at this point, but suffice to say that it's always worth considering where it is that you acquired the expectations you have for communication or relationships, and how those expectations shape the way that you interact with people or the way that you don't interact with people. One facet of expectations is the idea of being able to do well at a job or at school or something like that. So if you're someone who tends to be very good at achieving things, and you tend to get good grades, and you work hard, and you tend to be able to do a good job when you set your mind to it, you tend to be somebody probably who would expect to have a future where you are able to acquire gainful employment that you enjoy, that you find rewarding and meaningful, and things like that. So expectations definitely shape the way that we interpret the world and how we expect the world to be in the future. Another facet of interpretation is knowledge. So knowledge about a person or a situation will shape how we interpret our conversations or our interactions with people when we have them. So a good example for this would be, let's say you have a roommate, and for the most part, you and your roommate tend to get along pretty well. And one day you're at home, and your roommate comes home from school, and they don't really make any conversation, and they slam their bedroom door and just sort of walk into their room, with kind of a gruff attitude, and they don't really say much. Now, this behavior might be the opposite of what you've come to expect from the person, because you have had a nice living relationship for a while, so you folks have had a friendly interaction. However, you might also have the knowledge that this person has been struggling with school, or maybe they've had a difficult relationship issue lately. So that knowledge about the person and what they're dealing with often would serve to temper or influence the way that you interpret their behavior. So you might give them a less negative evaluation when they walk off to their room and slam the door, because you know that they're suffering emotionally or struggling emotionally. And so because of that knowledge, you're able to be more understanding about the situation. So knowledge definitely influences the way we interpret things and the way we respond in terms of behavior. However, interpretation also includes the self-concept. It probably is not surprising to discover that people who have a good self-concept or a positive self-concept, good self-esteem, tend to perceive or evaluate or interpret communication from other people in a more positive way. However, people that have challenges in self-esteem or challenges to their self-concept tend to interpret information in a more negative way. So this is one of the reasons why it's important to be conscious of these aspects of ourselves and how these things can shape the way that we perceive the world. In addition, interpretation includes relational satisfaction. Now, one thing that's interesting about relational satisfaction is that people who are in satisfying relationships tend to evaluate the communication behaviors of their partner in a more favorable way than people who are in less satisfying relationships. So this is a very interesting correlational relationship between satisfaction and the ways that people make sense of future events, right? So as you can see from this, it's sort of a cycle process. It's cyclical, where you have somebody who's in a satisfied relationship, and when they interact with their partner, they tend to assign more positive attributions, or they tend to interpret the information more favorably, right? And so, of course, that contributes to a more positive relationship and more relational satisfaction, right? However, if it's not a satisfying relationship, people may have less favorable responses or less favorable interpretations, and because of that, it contributes again, to a less satisfying relationship. So you can envision a circle with arrows going in a clockwise fashion, and these two ideas tend to play off each other and influence each other as well. Negotiation. Negotiation is the final stage in the perception process, and this is how we make sense of our perceptions through communication with other people that we are in relationships with. So, for example, narratives. Narratives are the stories that we tell about our relationship or about our history or about how things came to be the way they are today, right? We tend to use narratives or storytelling on a day-to-day basis in our interactions with people. And what's interesting about narratives is that romantic couples who have positive narratives about the development of their relationship, about the current relationship they have, about the way that they manage challenges in the relationship, those couples who have those positive narratives tend to be more happy and satisfied in their relationships than the couples who talk about their relationship with negative narratives. So this facet or this aspect of negotiation really points to the profound influence that conversation and words and communication and what we say and speak over our relationship has in terms of the relational satisfaction. So what this suggests then is that if we want a relationship to continue to stay positive or to become more positive, then just by learning to cultivate or hone in on the more positive aspects of the relationship, we can actually help to contribute to more happiness in the relationship. So think about this and think about the human tendency sometimes to be negative rather than positive, okay? And the tendency sometimes to see the glass as half empty rather than half full, and how that can shape our happiness in our relationships. Now, in terms of family systems and also couples, families that have shared narratives about the history or the current situations that they're going through tend to be more satisfied and happy as well. So for example, you have a family story, and let's say every Thanksgiving or every Christmas, somebody brings up the one time when the heat went out on Christmas Eve and we had to build a fire and use the oven, or, oh wait, the heat is electric. So we had to build a fire and, figure out various ways to stay warm. And, but it's a positive, adventurous story that talks about how we, were able to come together as a family and, sustain or survive something that was a less positive situation. But because the family system was strong and we came together, it actually turned out to be a really great Christmas experience. So those kinds of shared narratives have a lot of power in terms of satisfaction in the family or the relationship system. So think about that. What's interesting about shared narratives is the shared narratives that contribute to more satisfaction in family or couple situations don't even have to be completely accurate. So sometimes what happens is we tend to remember things maybe in a more favorable way. Sometimes over time we omit negative details. And what the research shows is that is perfectly okay as long as we are remembering the same things and talking about them and being supportive and engaging when we do talk about those things. Now we can also look at the way that different narratives tend to be negotiated. Another example to think about where we see a lot of different narratives playing out would be in litigation or court cases. Obviously, in litigation, you tend to have different stories based on what position you're at in the courtroom. And these types of narratives tend to shape the way that the jury might view the issue or the way that a judge might rule on the issue. And so that's another aspect of negotiation. And one thing about narratives and the power of narratives is the idea of rose-colored glasses. And when we go back up to the first number on this slide of the power of shared narratives that couples have that gives them more happiness, so if couples have a more positive narrative, they tend to be more satisfied. The research shows that rose-colored glasses, or the tendency to view your partner a bit more favorably than they actually are in reality tends to be a very powerful indicator or a powerful influence in terms of relationship satisfaction and relational survival and happiness long term. So what this suggests is that having a positive attitude, seeing the glass as half full, looking at all of the positive things that your partner brings to the relationship or all the positive things that your family members bring to the family, those types of information negotiation strategies tend to actually contribute to relational closeness and relational survival and relational happiness. And so it's definitely worth considering these things when we communicate in relationships. Now, when we discuss the idea of how we make sense of people and conversations and communication, one thing that's very important to consider, and I have touched on it in this lecture already, but one thing that's very important to consider is the idea of the self-concept. So what's interesting about the self-concept is that we tend to judge ourselves more favorably than other people. So why is that? Well, maybe some of us want to feel good about ourselves, and maybe one way that we achieve that is by judging or negatively evaluating other people, right? So we want to be careful of this tendency in human beings because most of us are going to at some point be in a situation where we might see this playing out, or maybe we might be on the receiving end of this tendency as well. And so this can obviously be a challenge because if we're being more critical of other people than we are of ourselves, then that can sometimes contribute to a double standard. We might be more harsh than we need to be, right? And we might make excuses for our behavior, but when other people do things that are undesirable, we might really, lean into them for it. So we want to be conscious of this tendency, and we want to use our knowledge about this tendency to temper our criticism of other people whenever possible. Because as we know from the research, positive communication begets more positive communication. And if you draw from the findings of Gottman, who studied thousands of couples who had marriages, what Gottman found is that the marriages and relationships that were the ones that ended up surviving and staying together over a long period of time were the ones where people had a 5-to-1 positive to negative communication ratio. So what that means is that in the happy, satisfied, stable marriages, people tended to have 5 positive communications for every 1 negative communication. So positive communication could be something like a supportive or loving hug or a touch or affection, or positive communication might include giving a gift or doing an act of service to someone. Positive communication might include being a good listener or being empathic or showing understanding when your friend or partner or family member needs it. Positive communication might even be verbal compliments, words of affirmation, okay? So think about that in your relationships and think about the fact that you can influence the quality of your relationship by the decisions you make about how to communicate about within those relationships. Related to the first idea of the self-concept is the second idea, which is we attend or notice negative information more about other people than we do about ourselves. Probably not surprising, definitely understandable from a human perspective, but still, this is something that can be very challenging in relationships, especially if we tend to make excuses for ourselves, but tend to not make excuses or not be understanding to the limitations that other people have as well, okay? So think about this. Also, the self-concept tends to be influenced by the fact that we are influenced by the obvious. So we tend to notice the things that are something that we take as a given rather than things that are more subtle, okay? This might also include more superficial types of cues, right? We might not notice the things that are underlying a communication, but we might notice the things that are intense or drastic or more broad. So you can think about how we're influenced more by the obvious things, and because of this, we might miss certain types of communication subtleties that other people might be giving us. Okay, so this is always a good time to think about the idea of perception checking, which we're going to get into in the next slide here. And we can think about perception checking as a way of honing in on whether we are perceiving a situation correctly or whether we need to assimilate more information so that we actually understand what another person is meaning or what they are intending to communicate. Another self-concept idea is that we tend to maintain first impressions over long periods of time. What this means is that it can be very difficult for other people to change the opinions that we have about them. Likewise, it can also be very difficult for us to change the impressions that other people have about us, right? So you want to think about this, especially when we go into our professional interactions. These first impressions sometimes can be the deciding factor in whether we get the job that we want, whether we land the client account that we want, whether we are able to have access to some kind of promotion that we want, okay? So these are very important things to consider in our communication, both professionally and also personally. Finally, another aspect of self-concept that can sometimes challenge effective interpersonal communication is that we tend to assume that other people are similar to us in terms of their beliefs, attitudes, values, and practices. Now, sometimes other people may be similar to us, and other times they may not be. But it's very easy for me, for example, to assume when I meet, let's say, another professor, that maybe we have similar things that we consider to be important in terms of how we use our time, right? So obviously professors do things like teaching, research, and service, okay? And maybe I am a professor that really enjoys the teaching component, right? So I might go and approach another professor to talk about teaching and how much I appreciate it and enjoy teaching and all the great experiences that I have, working with students. However, I might assume that they like teaching, and in actuality, they may not care for teaching that much. They may actually like the research part of being a professor, or they may appreciate doing community service much more. But because of the fact that I'm a professor and they're a professor, I might just assume, well, they're just like me. And it could lead to a potentially awkward situation, right? If I say something that they have to disagree with, or they have to challenge or criticize because that's not true for them, right? So as I said in a previous slide, it's always good for us to seek to understand people and to ask questions, right? Rather than making assumptions. Checking perception. One very valuable skill to take away from this lecture is the perception check process. The perception checking process involves describing a behavior, providing two interpretations of the behavior, and then requesting for clarification on your interpretation to see if your interpretation is correct or if there's some information that you were not accounting for when you concluded or interpreted the situation. Let me provide an example for you. So, for example, I might be dealing with a situation, let's say, where I have a roommate. I gave this example previously in this lecture, so I'm going to draw from it again. So let's say you folks have a roommate. You're in college. A lot of college students tend to have roommates, right? I certainly did many years ago. And you have a nice relationship with your roommate. Things are going well. You have no reason to really have any problems or concerns. And maybe they come home from school one day and they throw down their books and run into the bathroom and stay in there for 20 minutes. Okay, and don't say anything. Okay, so that's obviously a divergence from the norm of what you've come to expect for normal behavior for your roommate. Okay, let's say your roommate tends to be fairly friendly and nice. So you're wondering what's going on. So you start to think about it and you wonder, I wonder, did I do something wrong? Is this because I took one of the apples they had in the fridge this morning for a snack? Or maybe it's because I ate their last Hershey's chocolate bar last night. Or maybe they just had a bad day and I don't know. So this is where the perception checking process is very valuable because it allows you to get on the same page with people in terms of information about what's actually going on in people's experience. So what I would do in this situation, using the checking perception skill, would be something like the following. I would say I would maybe go knock on my roommate's door kind of softly and tentatively don't want to bang on someone's door when they're obviously already upset, right? Want to use our good judgment here. So I might knock on the door and I might say something like, "Oh, hi. I don't mean to bother you, but I noticed when you came in today that you seemed a little bit flustered or upset or something. And first I wondered, oh gosh, well, I wonder if you're upset because I ate one of your apples from the fridge. And then I thought, well, no, maybe it's not that. Maybe you just had a bad day at school. So I just wanted to see, is there something going on? And, I can go and buy you a whole bag of apples if you're upset that I ate that one apple, because I don't mind fixing the situation. I just don't want there to be problems because we're roommates and I appreciate you being a good roommate and you're my friend and everything like that. So I just wanted to check and see, did you just have a bad day or did I do something wrong? Because I would like to be able to fix it so that we can go back to having a good day together. And so as you can see, this perception check described the behavior. So I talked about, I noticed that you came in and you seemed flustered. I provided two interpretations of the behavior, right? I described that maybe they were upset because I ate some of their food, or maybe they just had a bad day. And then the third, I asked for clarification on what was actually going on with them. So the benefit of being able to use this skill in relationships is that it allows us to open up the lines of supportive, effective communication when there are difficulties. And it allows us significant ability in terms of being able to acquire the ideas about what's going on that are correct rather than making assumptions that are incorrect, right? Because if we make assumptions about what people are experiencing and we're wrong, that can actually exacerbate a situation because then we might react based on what we think is going on rather than what is going on, and that can actually make things worse, okay? So for this chapter, we've talked a lot about perception checking. There are several different aspects of perception in general, and so I encourage you to think about these issues as you go about your relationships. I encourage you to think about your history and how your history has shaped the assumptions you have about the world and how those assumptions shape the expectations that you have for yourself and other people, okay? And also, if you can take away the perception checking activity or the skill set here, I think that would probably provide some benefits for you folks in terms of figuring out how to deal with difficult situations that come up as well. Thank you for your time, and I will talk to you all in Chapter 4.